All right, hello again. Great to see you all. Great to see my fellow panelists. We are just double checking that the technology is not letting us down, as I recognize that we are a few minutes late. We've had some technical issues, but we are working hard to solve them. So bear with us. Right. How's it looking, Kasia? We're live, we're good? Okay, excellent. Well, that's good news. Well, first and foremost, our apologies for being a little late. As I mentioned, we had some technical issues, but we are up and running once again. So it's a real pleasure to be here. And thank you so much for bearing with us and your patience. Well, we are definitely very eager to begin the conversation. We'd probably be already knee deep into some of the topics, but do not worry about it. We will get there. So first and foremost, thank you so much for being here once again. Thank you for coming here from the previous conversation. If you're new here, welcome. This is Impactful Leader LinkedIn Live series that we have created to talk about everything and anything leadership development with an intent to raise leadership development and leadership skill standards globally. So for those who haven't met me yet, my name is Baiba Jiga, and I am a workplace culture strategist and a leadership coach. And I'm here with two of my wonderful colleagues, Chaba and Sandra. So we'll do quick rounds of introduction, and we shall get into the topic and kind of like set a little bit of a scene to why are we back here? Why are we talking about it? So, Sandra, please take it away.
Yes, good to see everyone again. For those of you that were part of the first session, glad that you're back. But Sandra Upton, I am the founder and chief diversity, equity, and inclusion strategist with Upton Consulting Group, which is a global firm based in the U.S., but work with organizations all over the world to help them move their diversity, equity, and inclusion work forward.
Thank you.
It is Chaba, and I'm based in the UK. I'm the founder of ICQ Global, and we specialize in measuring and optimizing psychological safety, cognitive diversity, and motivational drivers. There's three invisible forces that make or break a team.
Love that. Thank you so much for those lovely introductions. And I already can see some comments coming in. Nadej, welcome. And thank you for dropping the first comment, because I can see that that part of technology is working. So I'm really, really pleased about that. And welcome everyone else who might be here or might be watching us on replay. Same thing as last time. The chat will be open the whole time, so please drop us a hello, engage with us in this conversation, because we don't kind of want to talk at you the whole time. We are really, really interested in your views, any of your reflections and insights, because we do know that a lot of the people who join these conversations are either in leadership positions and they are interested in these topics, or there are people who are practicing these topics as practitioners, as consultants, as coaches who go into organizations and help them with cultural intelligence, with leadership development, with diversity and inclusion. And so we would love to hear from all of you as well. So once again, chat will be open. It will be monitored throughout the session. So please engage with us. So in terms of this session, so last time we had our inaugural session and we talked about culturally intelligent leadership. And we had such lovely uptake and engagement in the previous session, and people were messaging us afterwards saying that they wished the conversation went on for longer just because they found so much value in it. And so we said, Say no more. We will be back, same time, same place, same company. So we have kept our promise, and we are back here with a second episode of this LinkedIn Live, and we will continue our conversation, kind of like from where we left last time, but we will also apply an additional layer on top of that conversation, which will be psychological safety. Because we do truly believe that we can't talk about leadership, we can't talk about inclusion, we can't talk about any of these big important topics, big important elements as part of organizational success without talking about psychological safety. So hence it is one of the kind of like first conversations that we wanted to engage in. And so perhaps same time, same way as we started last time. Let's start there, and let's talk about what is psychological safety. Because again, same as cultural intelligence, as we already discussed last time, these are big words, often unfortunately reduced to a buzzword. However, they mean something, and they actually are integral elements within an organizational culture, and as I said, in organizational success. So let's just make sure that, again, the three of us and everyone else who has joined us, that we engage in this conversation from the same page. And so let's begin there. What is psychological safety? How do you go about defining it? Because I know that you work with this topic, day in, day out. And perhaps not just what is psychological safety, but even more important, why should we care about it? Sandra, you're nodding. I think you already have the answer to your tongue. Go for it.
Absolutely. Yeah, I think it's a great question to start with, like you said, so that we can level set. But there's a lot of research around the topic, and I know Csaba is continuing in that research. And like you said, I am engaged in this type of conversation all the time, because you really can't talk about it. I posted the other day, when we talk about diversity, equity, and inclusion, you certainly can't talk about the I in DEI, the inclusion piece, without psychological safety, or you certainly can't create an inclusive culture if people don't feel psychologically safe. So I followed the research of Amy Edmondson for a very long time. She's a Harvard professor, and she's done a lot of research around this work, and wrote the book, The Fearless Organization. And I love her definition. It's the shared belief that it's okay or safe to take risks, to make mistakes, to express ideas and concerns, even when they go against the status quo, right? To be comfortable speaking up. Well, I don't want to use the word comfortable yet, because I think I want to talk about what psychological safety doesn't mean, but they feel safe speaking up and asking questions and admitting mistakes, all without fear of there being negative consequences to those actions and behaviors. So I think that's a really good definition that sums up what psychological safety is. And the reason that it's important is sort of part two to your question, again, is because when we talk about I'm coming at this work from a diversity, equity, and inclusion perspective, and we cannot create. We can get the diversity, right? So we can bring diverse representation into the organization, but we cannot create authentically inclusive and equitable organizations if people don't feel psychologically safe. And so it is a non-negotiable quality or value that the organization must have if we're going to truly create an inclusive culture.
Thank you for those opening remarks, Sandra. I think you've laid a very nice foundation, and allow Csaba to build upon it in literally just a second. And I just wanted to kind of say, for everyone who is here, same question goes to you. While we kind of like talk about and set the scene, same question goes to you. Why should we care about psychological safety? Perhaps what about the topic of psychological safety has brought you here today? So please let us know in the chat, as we would love to hear from you where you're at with this topic. Csaba, please, I'll let you build upon it.
I mean, Sandra explained it pretty well, the definition, so I think we could just explain what is not. And like she already referred to it, it's not physical comfort. Mm-hmm. And I think often people misunderstand it. It's not about being nice to people. It's not about not having any conflicts. And most importantly, it's not a marketing tool. And I think we have to mention that, because a lot of people use it as a buzzword, as a promotional tool, without offering actual solutions. And I think that is almost like an intellectual appropriation. And that is not necessarily contributing to growth or inclusion, because diversity is just the potential. It is really important, but diversity exists no matter what. Inclusion is the difficult part. So that's the reason why we have to focus on that. We have to measure it, because if you cannot get it right, then diversity is going to be messy. It's not going to give you any benefits. We have to create the right environment. And that right environment is high on psychological safety and motivation. That is when you can turn your differences into synergy. Without it, it's going to be a big mess. And then people might come to the wrong conclusion that, this was just fake news, it doesn't work. No, you just didn't know how to make it work. It's not about the topic, it's how you go about it. There is a science to it. There are certain steps that you can take, and certain steps you have to avoid in order to get the best results. If you do that, you likely get the results.
Thank you for that, and thank you for that layer of what is not. Sometimes it is as important to define what it is as much as what it is not. And I think you also talked about it last time in our last conversation. Where you said it absolutely is not a marketing tool, and it is. There is a science to operationalizing it. So when we simply throw around buzzwords and we put buzzwords on our, DEI or any kind of like internal PR, without actually practicing that, of course, that at some point becomes fake news, or this doesn't work, why should I care about it? So I think it also is very, very important to, at the time as an organization or as leaders, when we start talking about and start using these terms, we have to be serious about it, because otherwise we perpetuate harm, with kind of like trust in the actual value in these topics. And speaking of trust, I kind of like think about psychological safety, because sometimes it sounds like a complex term, but I think of psychological safety as trust in a group setting. That's probably a very kind of like simple, way of putting that. And, if we kind of consider the trust happens between, in small groups or between, individuals, then psychological safety is kind of like a group feeling of trust. And that's, in very simple, terms, how we should be looking at it. And so, okay, so we've defined, or at least painting the scene of what psychological safety is. And, since this conversation is very much about helping leaders to operationalize some of these things that we talk about, last time about cultural intelligence and this time about psychological safety. And so I'm curious, in your, expert experience, because you work with these topics so closely, how can leaders find out the state of the psychological safety within their teams or within their organizations? How do they know that their people feel psychologically safe? What do they need to do?
I'll let Chava go first.
Sacrifice me. I think there are two main approaches. The most popular one is that people are just guessing and hoping for the best. That is the mainstream idea. And then there is the scientific one, when you can actually measure it. And that's the reason why I mentioned that it's not a marketing tool, because a lot of people talk about it, and then you ask them, how do you actually measure it? So you can intentionally and precisely address the root causes of the issues. Then they post another article or another motivational quote. But that's not helping anyone. Talking about psychological safety is not going to create it. But as soon as you can measure it, you can break it down, and you can create meaningful conversations driven by data and rooted in science, then we can do that. But don't forget that the assessment on its own can provide only the data. But data without story is powerless. But stories without data are just noise. But when you combine both, then you can create really meaningful conversations. We get the insights from the people. But it's really difficult to talk about something if you don't have the word for it, if you don't know the concept. You just feel that something is good or something is bad, but you don't know what it is. But if you cannot explain it to me, then how can we sort it out? So instead of guessing, let's measure what matters. And then often you realize that most of the problems are due to misunderstanding. And that's where cultural intelligence is so important, because you see other people's behavior, but you just assume their intention. And we know that that assumptions tend to be negative. We have this negativity bias. But we have to be able to talk about these things. And I think that is the missing skill nowadays, because people are scared. They don't know what if I use the wrong word? What if somebody chooses to get offended? What if? So what's the alternative? I stay quiet. And then from a leader's perspective, it might seem there's no conflict, nobody's complaining, everything must be all right. And usually that's a sure sign that you have no psychological safety.
Yeah, I love everything that you said, and I would just add to that. I think it goes back to your first question. I think one of the ways that leaders can assess it is to really understand what it is themselves. So sometimes leaders don't really understand what psychological safety is, and as Chava and I both mentioned, it's not necessarily about people feeling comfortable all of the time. So being safe and comfortable are two very different things. Now, you can be uncomfortable and still be in a safe environment. That's part of the taking the risk. So I think leaders need to be really clear on what psychological safety is, so they even have sort of that foundation by which to begin to assess if those things that we described earlier, this feeling comfortable taking, I keep using the word comfortable and I don't mean to do that, but feeling safe, taking risks, expressing ideas and concerns, all without the fear of negative consequences. I think the other thing, so I think there's just some proactive prerequisite things that leaders need to do to position themselves to be able to assess. So again, having that foundational understanding of what it is. And then I think the other piece is that they have to be an active listener, because they need to understand that different people, different cultural groups, different individuals, psychological safety means something different to them, right? So what's safe for me in terms of speaking out might be different. So taking some time to actively listen to what people's needs are and what their fears and concerns are. And I think there's also an important role that perspective taking should take in terms of that leader. And that's a bit different than having empathy. And so I think those are things that they need to lead with, just to get to level set and get that foundation. And once they have that understanding and they're actively listening and using perspective taking, then they can use that to assess whether or not people are actually speaking up without fear of negative consequences. They can assess for whether or not people are actually, taking risk. And then that will give them some indication as to whether or not they've really created this culture of psychological safety or not.
Very, very good. Both reflection points. Again, kind of like going back to understand first and foremost what that is. And it makes me think also about any kind of like big term that we use, within an organizational space, be it inclusion, be it culture, especially the terms that are relatively elusive. And I again, use that loosely. They're kind of like not things that you can wrap your hands around, and they're not as tangible, and that what makes them a little bit elusive, and therefore makes them a little bit more difficult for leaders to contextualize them. And I think this is where it becomes very important to not only kind of understand psychological safety or any of these terms by definition, but really what does it look like when we operationalize it. And then once we understand that, then we can start kind of like going backwards to understanding, okay, what behaviors does unpin that? Okay, what skills do I need to be able to display those behaviors so that I can, create an environment which is psychologically safe? And I think often with leaders, we kind of throw them in the deep end, and this is a very interesting conversation that I was having in my LinkedIn chat under my latest post today, where I was saying, when was the first time you had leadership training? And people said, I've never had it. 2 decades into it, I've never had it. And so yeah, it's important to pay attention to not only what we are throwing around, but actually how we are practicing that, how we are equipping our, not just our leaders, but every person to practice it, to have the skills to practice it. So just wanted to kind of like reflect on that, why it is so important to understand these terms beyond their definitions, and really start, creating spaces where they can be operationalized.
So
And
do you think that,
please go on.
just thinking about what you said, do you think that these are the main challenges that the leaders face when they want to create psychological safety, or there are different ones?
Whether these are the main challenges the leaders face?
Mm-hmm.
Probably so. They are at the top there, absolutely, because I think, part of that is also that the kind of like the key challenges that the leaders face when it comes to implementing, psychological safety, absolutely, is that lack of understanding of what it means beyond the definition that they can Google on the first Google page. But also, I think, the people who need to create these psychologically safe spaces predominantly are within the middle management. Obviously, they are at every level, but the middle managers are the population that lead or manage the kind of like the majority of our workforce. And when they are overworked, when they have no time to take their lunch break or take a loo break, at what point do we expect them to operationalize psychological safety? Probably, good manager, a good leader who, takes pride in their work and goes out of their way to develop these skills will do that. But within the organization, we shouldn't just expect that people will show up and one day will do these things and we will get all the innovation and success and growth in the world that we want our organizations to produce. But we also need to put resources behind, and not only kind of in the sphere of developing new and emerging leaders, but also thinking about our aging population within our workforces. Because one of the things, again, in the post that I talked about today, was that there is about a 10-year gap between when someone becomes a people manager and when they actually receive their first leadership training. And of course, here we can start strategizing about what can we do better with our young leaders? But actually, with the demographic and with the kind of lack of shortage of talent that is about to, hit us in the face in the next 5 years or so, how are we also developing, redeveloping, and upskilling our population that's 50 plus? Because again, according to that Harvard Business Review graph that I shared, less than 10% of those 55 plus get any leadership training whatsoever. And that's really alarming, considering that someone at an age of 55 still have a good decade under their belt within organizations or within the workforce. So it's not just about thinking about emerging leaders. Absolutely, we need to equip our people to be able to do the work, but also thinking about how are we making it sustainable throughout the life cycle of our employees. So
Yeah.
I think there are a couple of challenges there, major ones.
Yeah, I would agree that those are real challenges. And I would also, go back to what Chaba said earlier. I think one of the challenges is that leaders lack cultural intelligence. They don't understand that it is a skill. So it goes beyond, just being sensitive to and aware of the different cultural dynamics that may be at play on the team, or the different needs that people have, or how each person is viewing what feels safe for them. That is really the foundation. And then, when we understand what cultural intelligence is and we start to unpack that, it requires confidence. And I think that's also another challenge that a lot of leaders have if they've not been equipped with the skills to build their confidence and courage to lead. That can be a challenge, because if you truly are creating a psychologically safe environment, again, that's where people are pushing back on the status quo. They're challenging things. They are taking risk. Oftentimes they are more knowledgeable than you as the leader in certain areas around certain technical skills. And that requires a very confident leader. Because if you're not confident and people start to push back, then you begin to question, whether or not you're leading effectively, or you actually get worse and you start to hoard over people and manage them versus lead them. And that certainly undermines any effort to create a more psychologically safe environment. So I think those are some of the challenges where leaders have really not been upskilled in terms of developing their cultural intelligence, understanding that confidence and humility are really important characteristics of a leader that desires to create a psychologically safe space.
Csaba, would you like to join us?
I mean, apart from what you mentioned, I've got slightly very different take on it, because I think that leaders face two main challenges on top of what you mentioned. And one is that psychological safety is slowly being weaponized. Just like, when we started with the D&I field, the topic itself is really important. But when we overdo it and people use it as a weapon, especially employees, then it can backfire. Meaning that if you say something that I don't like, then, I don't feel safe anymore. And then the leaders get scared. Did I do anything wrong? And that shouldn't be the case. So every single good idea can turn into a really bad one if it's overdone. And that can be a problem. But the other side of that is that often the employees expect the leader to almost feed them with psychological safety. Make me feel safe. Yeah, that's just part of it. That's 50% of the equation. The other part is you. Because within the same environment, people can have very different sense of psychological safety and motivation. That's exactly what our assessments show. It can show you how polarized the team is. How come that within the same environment, some people feel like fish in the water, others feel rejected and demotivated? What's the reason? And at that point, we don't know because we have only the data. But when we do the debrief, then we find out, is it possible that the leader has the favorite people? Is it possible?
I believe Csaba has frozen.
Yes.
Okay.
And now?
You're back, you're good.
When did I disappear?
You disappeared literally just for about 10 seconds. So rewind a couple of sentences and start from there.
I'm so passionate that I cannot remember it. But the point is that, when people just expect the leaders to make them feel safe, but that's not the case. It's up to you. And that's exactly what our assessments can reveal as well, that the team can be very polarized. That some people feel safe, others feel rejected and demotivated. And then we have to create those conversations. What is the real reason? Is it because the leader has favorite people? Is it because somebody's too different? Is it because I've got a corporate PTSD from the previous job? So no matter what you do, I don't feel safe. But my perception is my reality. Whatever that might be, it's going to determine how much I contribute, collaborate, and innovate. So instead of shaming the company into inclusion, maybe we need to provide more support to certain members of the team. They need more coaching. They need something else. So that's what I mentioned in the beginning, that we have to measure what matters instead of guessing. Because if you provide a solution for something that is not the real issue, you're not going to get the results that you're hoping for or paying for. And that's a tragedy.
Yeah, and I think, to build off of that, I think that's why, the role of cultural intelligence is something that's needed on both sides. And so there's oftentimes, as we are again are trying to create this psychologically safe environment, this inclusive environment, we've got to make sure that the leader and those who are individual contributors or part of the team, that they are also improving their cultural intelligence so that everybody is coming to that exchange or those interactions in ways that are fair and create the environment where people are willing to talk about things together, admit things that they need to work on. And, like you said, Chaba, if I'm coming to a situation and I'm just, the reason I don't feel safe really has nothing to do with my leader. It's because of, again, what I experienced before. But there's responsibility on both sides. So I think it is the responsibility of the leader to acknowledge that all of those different dynamics can be at play. And so they do need to be able to facilitate conversations and spaces where people can be safe to share that, but it does require skills on both sides of the work, or in order for it to ultimately really end up being this space where everybody is feeling safe and functioning effectively together.
100%. And I think it again speaks to the fact that leadership skills are not tied to a particular role to say, well, now you're a leader because you own this job title. So now we're going to start, creating some trainings around what you actually need to do. There is so much that we need to pour in at every stage, at every level, so that, again, when someone becomes a quote unquote leader, all that responsibility is not on them, and also that they have some material to actually work with. Because when you do have a bunch of very talented people, very capable people with very little self-awareness, it is also a very hard place to be. And so, again, that's when leaders kind of like become these scapegoats of, being poor leaders. And there absolutely are, plenty of, poor leaders, people who haven't been developed. So I think there's, back to Sandra's point, there is absolutely a shared responsibility from the employees, from the leaders, and also from the organization in how we are actually moving our people through their career. I'm not going to say, the career ladder, because some people don't necessarily have a ladder, but a very, linear kind of leveled career, but how we move our people throughout their career journeys. And as we're talking about this, there are a couple of comments that have come in that I just want to pull up where people are just reflecting on what we're talking about. And Nadej is saying that I believe many leaders sometimes are not aware of their own behavior and the consequences those can have on their teams. For example, they could make what they perceive as a joke, but that would burst the psychological safety of the team because they would take that joke at a face value. And so again, Nadej is reflecting the self-awareness is really important. So I think we've addressed the question that she's asking as well. And we've got Vincent saying psychological safety is quite a Western individualistic concept. What about views from more group-oriented cultures where it's rather shared within the group and not so much on an individual basis? Very good question. Any thoughts on this?
Again, I think that's where cultural intelligence comes in, right? I think cultural intelligence considers that you have, if we think about this from a global perspective, you have those different values that are represented in different cultures across the globe. So just having that understanding should influence how you as a leader approach the situation. And it should have some influence on that. So if you are leading a group that, or generally, people are coming at it from an individualism perspective, having that awareness is important, and then using cultural intelligence to navigate through that. Vice versa, if you are, again, dealing with a culture where it is more collectivist, how do you adapt your leadership in terms of listening and understanding and operationalizing how you work to create a psychologically safe culture? And I think the self-awareness piece is important, but you can't stop there, because just because I'm self-aware, that's really important, again, in terms of, my own leadership and, again, how confident I am or the lack of confidence. That's important for me to understand that, but then I've got to move beyond that self-awareness to the cultural intelligence piece, where I begin to build the skills that are needed in order to lead. And I think the other piece of the conversation is, part of it is how we define leadership. I know we're talking about it within the context of someone who actually has people reporting to them. But I think, another way we look at leadership is not just from a positional perspective, but that we all if we have some level of influence on other people, I might not be a leader of people in terms of being a department head or the CEO, but I may lead a team on occasion, or I may lead a project. All of those roles still making a commitment to create psychological safety in those different situations is just as important as if you were the CEO of the organization. So I think, all of us need to understand that we have a shared responsibility in creating psychological safety, which again goes back to some of those other qualities around self-awareness, cultural intelligence, confidence that we all need.
Very good point. And I also want to name the fact that absolutely, the kind of West is a very individualistic society, and we have many challenges that come with that. But I also want to name the fact that not all collectivist societies have psychological safety.
Mhm.
There are some that absolutely do, and that use the kind of like this collectivist and community power in a very, very healthy way. However, there are many examples in history and also current where unfortunately not necessarily the collectivist society as such, or that the psychological safety is given in those spaces. So I think it's not necessarily just about collectivist versus individualistic, but about who and what are we centering within those spaces. So, but a very, very good point as part of this conversation, because Vincent, you're absolutely right. Often when we talk about be diversity and inclusion, be any of these topics, the kind of like the Western ideology is absolutely very, very centered. And I would even go as far as saying that the US and American ideology is very, very centered, because often when it comes to these topics and the popularity of them, they're much more mature to where we are potentially in Europe and other parts of the world. But a very, very good point. Did you want to say anything on this, Csaba?
Well, I've got again a slightly different take on it, because personally, it doesn't really matter if psychological safety is shared on individual or group level, because it's about the individuals at the end of the day. So whatever you perceive, it's going to determine what you do. And if you are not feeling safe enough to speak up, to report a mistake or bring up an idea, then innovation is not going to happen. And we have plenty of case studies. We work with a lot of different teams across the globe. So we have the data. And there's not a huge difference, to be honest. There isn't. Because some teams are great, some teams are polarized, others are not. So especially if you look at the individuals, if you look at the personality types, the biggest research was done by Insights Discovery, when they asked more than 500,000 people, complete the assessment. And what they realized was that wherever you go, you find the same type of personalities, and even the proportion is pretty much the same. Now the question is, what do you have to conform to? Because that is what culture is. So assuming that just because you're in a collectivist culture, then you think like that, that's not exactly true. So, when we see these updates that just, crack the code of how people get things done across cultures, meaning nationalities, that has nothing to do with science. That's just not true. What they have to conform to, how they have to behave, even subconsciously, that would be correct. But how individuals think and feel, that is just not true. And we have plenty of data to back that up. So we can use it as an excuse. Yes, it can be a guiding principle, because it is important. I mean, if you look at, for example, the US case studies, technically, if you look at the international models, that's the most individualistic country. Yet there was zero psychological safety in certain hospitals because the doctors were like gods. The nurses couldn't say anything, so patients died because of that. So it can happen everywhere. It's a tiny little bubble, and we have to focus on that, because companies don't change, people change. So we do it step by step.
Interesting point. Thank you for adding that layer as well to the conversation, Csaba. And as you brought us back to an individual level, I'm curious because we've been talking about skills, we've been talking about behaviors. What are perhaps some specific skills that you can name, behaviors or skills that are, again, in your experience, particularly effective in promoting psychological safety? And especially in hybrid context, in which a lot of organizations are finding themselves in.
Yeah, I go back to where I started. I think two really important practical skills that you need are active listening. And part of that listening includes asking questions. I think that's one of the more powerful, simple things that we can do. But it's amazing how many leaders don't do a good job of being active listeners. And when I think the active is important there, because part of it is asking the right questions, in terms of how people are feeling, and what is it they feel like they need to feel safe. But then the other part of that is, following up, as the leader, on some of the feedback they receive, because there's nothing worse than taking time to listen and asking for feedback. And then if you don't follow up, if you don't do anything with it, you put yourself in a worse position than if you would have just not asked the question in the first place. So I think that's a really a fundamental but simple practice that it is amazing how many leaders don't practice it, just taking the time to listen. And I think the other one, again, is perspective taking, just really trying to put yourself, and I think there is research around it, but putting yourself in the other person's shoes, as we say, to really try and understand why they think the way they think about something, and rather than just having empathy. So empathy is saying, I feel, I'm sensitive to, the fact that you may have a different perspective on this, or that you may be feeling a certain way. But perspective taking is actually saying, okay, I'm going to think about how you're feeling, and what are the consequences or impact of those feelings on this situation, on our relationship, on building trust, on creating psychological safety. So I think those are some fundamental basic things that leaders can do that can very much inform how they can and might need to adjust their behaviors to create psychological safety in the organization or on their teams.
Okay. Personally, I'm a big fan of listening, but I also learned my lesson that people can only see and hear what they know. And I think that limits people. Because in the past, it happened to me that I asked a question, somebody answered, I thought I understood the answer, and it turned out I was wrong. So I fully agree with you that perspective taking and is really important. But that's something we need to learn, because most people need to. I had to, because I had no idea. And as it turned out, then, because, for example, we put everything on the sliding scale, because, the world is not binary, even though that's what it feels like sometimes. But everything is on a sliding scale. And when you look at your report, if you are very much on the left or the right-hand side, then half of the world doesn't make sense. And I'm one of those people. And I thought, what is wrong with those people? I should teach them how to do it properly. And then it turned out that, no, actually, they are right from their perspective. But I had no idea. I couldn't even imagine it. I had to learn it. And then it doesn't mean I like it, but it makes sense. And now I can see how they can complement me. But before that, I didn't know how to do that.
Yeah. And that's why there's such a big difference between empathy and perspective taking. Because if you just stop at empathy, you still can be in that place of not really understanding what's creating that difference, in terms of the view and perspective on the situation. And so you've got to go to that next level of really saying this, okay, I see why this person sees this situation this way. And you can then use that to inform how you might adjust your leadership and your behaviors.
I love that. And it kind of like makes me think that it's not just about, because again, as you began your remarks, Andrew, you were saying that, active listening, and absolutely, and people talk about active listening, but again, when you actually go to people and you say, what does that really look like beyond nodding your head, looking someone in the eye, what does that really mean, right? And so one of the things is, I think, not just asking the question for the sake of asking, or curiosity, or God forbid judgment, but also really staying with that question and not being afraid of staying with that question. We don't always have to fix everything, answer everything, and move on. Some things we need to marinate on, and we need to reflect on, and some things need to mature within ourselves. Today we don't understand the perspective. we gotta flow through the process. Sometimes we do need to stay with the questions and not be afraid of that as well.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think part of it, again, when you talk about some of the basic, skills as it relates to having courage and confidence and humility, because part of it as an impactful leader, it requires, if we're going to create these psychologically safe spaces, it does require decentering ourselves. Right. And so, if you think about a good example of empathy versus perspective taking, right? So you can come to me, Baba, and ask me questions. I'm on your team. And, well, Sandra, how do you feel about, what happened yesterday? Or how do you feel about, a certain situation? And then I can share with you all of my feelings about it and why I didn't feel safe and the empathetic Baba can say, you can nod and say, oh, I understand. And you can even feel bad about, the impact that situation had on me. That's empathy. But if you just stop there, think about it, it's just about you understand, right? But perspective taking, shifting over to perspective taking says, okay, let me really get into, as I'm listening to her, let me think about the impact, not just how she's feeling, but the impact of what happened on her, whether that's on her ability to do the job or to feel safe. That's a whole different level of listening. And it completely removes the emphasis off of you as the leader. It decenters you and really allows you to hone in on me, the recipient of, or the person that you're trying to get to feel safe in the organization. That's a huge shift. And I think it's significant in terms of our ability to create that inclusive environment where people are feeling safe.
Who are we centering in this conversation? Who are we centering in the solution? Who are we centering when we talk about ... That's the, what the whole inclusion conversation is about, isn't it? Is that, who is centered here? What are we protecting here? Whose comfort or, something else? So, yeah.
I would also upgrade the active listening with a preemptive strike, which sounds a bit violent, but I think it's really peaceful because I learned that lesson as well, that sometimes when I ask a question, then sometimes it is seen as almost criticism or it can be seen as sarcastic. So I would rather over communicate and say, listen, I'm asking because I'm genuinely interested. Not because I'm taking the piss. It's just because I really want to understand what you are saying. But sometimes when you ask back or ask a question, then people see that as a negative feedback or a criticism that, oh, I did something wrong. So, no, I'm just interested. Plus, if you add this face to it, it doesn't help. So I also had to learn, no, that is true, because when I think hard, then I look angry. So I also have to mention it. So when I do a workshop, I tell people in advance that don't misunderstand me. I'm not angry because, that's not helping anyone. I try to work on it, but just in case, if I look angry, that equals I'm thinking, I do care. I'm not angry.
Yeah.
So, active listening with preemptive strike, I think works.
Yeah. And I also think, say this very quickly, but I also think, again, part of that cultural intelligence requires understanding, where people are, where the organization is, and the level of readiness. So, even though we talked earlier about, you gave the example, Chaba, of someone, having maybe bringing baggage from a previous situation. And so, their idea of not feeling safe really may be that it's because they're just carrying that mistrust into the organization and sort of projecting it on the leader. And even if that is the reality, the leader can't deny, you can't pretend like that's not there. So you still have a responsibility as a leader to manage that, right? To try and work through that, I think. And again, not abdicating responsibility on the part of that person. So again, everybody needs to be upskilled. But if I'm leading in that moment, I can't pretend like that's not part of the scenario. And so I have to take some lead in helping that person navigate through, those feelings and that perspective, and help bring them to a place where we are creating, this is a new situation. I'm different, and, let's work to create trust between the two of us. And I think the other piece of it is also when you have the different dynamics how you approach the person might be different, right? If we're active listening and we're asking questions, if there is zero trust there, it might not be a conversation. It might be initially it might be a survey that you do, just being mindful that you might have to get the information in different ways, depending on the status of that relationship or the current culture of the organization. And then you build up to, so if you're asking questions and you know that might be intimidating to someone because we don't have a relationship, we don't have trust, or your face might make it look like it's this hard nose, then maybe there's a different way to get the information initially as we build that relationship and build trust.
And there definitely is also that kind of like emotional regulation piece as well, and especially when it comes to leaders, because as leaders, our emotions have a multiplier effect on our teams, whether we are, and not just teams, but our whole organizations, whether we are impatient, whether we are fearful, commanding perhaps, or frustrated, these kinds of emotions can shut down a lot of conversations and can absolutely, hit the psychological safety out of the park. And but I understand about the preemptive strike, when you have a face like that. But I'm joking. This is a psychologically safe space, so you're good.
Also, on a personal note, just to expose you a little bit, because when we work on.
Okay, here we go. Remember, this is on record, so.
That's all good. So when we work on the ICQ Global Academy, and then you had an idea, and I just sent you a message, said, "Well, what's your logic there?" And most people would have got offended, because what they hear is that, "Oh no, that's stupid. Oh, he doesn't like it. Oh, something negative."
Yeah.
And then you explained. They said, "Oh wow, that's so refreshing. I mean, this should be normal, but it's not." And that was amazing to experience. That, look, she can reply, she can answer, she practices what she preaches. That's fantastic. And we have to get to that level, because otherwise we cannot have meaningful conversations. And that is the foundation.
Yeah, no, I think I'm one of those people that kind of like take a question on the face value. So someone's, if asking for a logic, I don't take it personally. Like, okay, let me break down the logic here. But absolutely, it wouldn't translate, or perhaps wouldn't translate the same way to other people as
Absolutely,
well.
Absolutely, yeah. And understanding that is cultural intelligence. Yeah.
And so as we are quickly, coming to an end of our session, and since we started a little bit later, some people will probably need to drop off. I just want to say that this session is recorded. It will be available on LinkedIn, on YouTube, and other places as well. So do not worry. You'll be able to come back and watch the final bit of our conversation as well. I just want to say thank you for those who did come to this live session, and those who are still with us on the replay. Stick around. And so the I guess final question that I would love to end our conversation on is, because we have talked about again, skills, and we've shared some practical ways, but perhaps you can share one key practical way that leaders and people who are here today can take away and to start establishing psychological safety within their teams and environments.
I'll let Csaba take the lead on that one.
I think, apart from the preemptive strike, which is very important, is over communicating. Because if you think that there is a chance that somebody can misunderstand what you said, or somebody can assume something, then it's better to say more. It's better to explain how you got to that decision. Because this is almost like the curse of knowledge. You know what it took to get to that point. They don't. And I think this is really important. Because people can, let's be honest, most of the time employees don't necessarily want to be right. But every single time they want to be heard. And if you don't give that to them, they get really frustrated, very disengaged. And in worst case, they're not leaving, but they're staying. And there's nothing worse than an actively disengaged person at work. You're paying them to ruin your business. And the real tragedy is that that probably that situation is based on a misunderstanding, the lack of clarity, the lack of communication. And the problem is not real, but it will be. So if there is a chance that they can misunderstand you, explain it.
Yeah, I love that. And I would just add to that, that communication piece, over communicating, which should include, building in a solid continuous feedback loop, right? So not only, continuing to communicate to people, but creating regular opportunities and spaces for them to provide in a diversity of spaces for people to provide feedback, and then ensuring that you are responding to that, even if you don't have all of the answers, as Csaba mentioned, or maybe you can't even do anything about it, but just having that some response to that, to say, here's the best way that I can address this situation or your concerns, and let's keep talking through it and keep working together. But I think that continuous loop of feedback, where people are having regular opportunities to share their thoughts and feelings, and then you're responding to them and acknowledge them.
And I'll add to everything that you already so eloquently have stated. I'll just go back to that emotional regulation piece as well, because this is work in progress. It always is and always will be work in progress. There always will be things and people and scenarios that will trigger us, that will get the worst out of us. And so we do have to give ourselves grace when those things happen. We do need to create space to respond rather than just react, but really pay attention to how we react to certain things, what are things that trigger us, and whether we allow that millisecond of processing that situation before jumping to conclusions, before reacting, before biting someone's head off. So that emotional regulation piece absolutely comes again, another foundational piece to that, which unfortunately, again, is one of those things that is not actively taught as part of our being upbringing journey, or then later within organizations, and we end up learning it ourselves as we do. So I just want to name that as well. But thank you so much, both of you, for being here, for all of your wonderful contributions, and again, making this another super insightful and interesting conversation. And also I want to say thank you to everyone who spent their hour with us in this setting, who came back again, and for those who also might be watching us on replay. So Kasia is very actively putting some links in the chat. So there are links to some of the work that we are doing on leadership development programs, and also Sandra's inaugural book that we had the book launch in London last week. So I'm sure you have seen a lot of content going around on LinkedIn. So I think it's a time for you to go and get the book as well if you don't yet have it. So thank you both so much. Thank you everyone who are here, who contributed and shared your reflections. Again, feel free on sharing the reflections after this conversation as well, as we will be going into the chat afterwards, and we'll be happy to engage with you, or reach out to us directly if you do not want to be in a public space with your questions. So thank you so much. And I have no doubt that we will see each other again in this or another setting. I think we have a lot to talk about. These conversations are ever evolving. And I just want to say we absolutely will be back in this setting, hopefully in the same company as well. So thank you so much.
Thank you.
Thank you.